Andrea Arnold, a critically acclaimed writer and director, was born on a council estate in Dartford, Kent. At 18, she began working as a host and actor for a TV show called Number 73, working in TV for the next 10 years before deciding to begin her filmmaking career at the American Film Institute Conservatory, graduating in 1991. In 2005, her short film Wasp won her the Academy Award for Best Live Action Short Film, and she went on to garner 3 Cannes Jury Prize-winning features: Red Road, Fish Tank, and American Honey. Grounded in stories capturing the lives of young working-class women, her work can be understood through the genre of British social realism, focusing on the raw, gritty realities of life in these urban settings. Her distinct, intimate style allows her to capture something raw and emotional, unlike the previous traditions of the social reel. As film journalist Brogan Morris puts it, Arnold is considered one of the preeminent artists of contemporary British cinema. Arnold's protagonists centre on the female working class experience, blending the traditions of British social realism with a poetic and intimate mode of storytelling. Through a distinct, non-judgmental lens, she shines a light on the social and structural injustices her characters face. Her work, however, has caused debate on whether or not it fits into the specific genre of British social realism. According to film historian John Hill, British social realism is characterised as representing the precarity of the working class. In many cases, those sections of the working class that are seen to be the most economically and socially disadvantaged. In this video essay, I will show how Arnold uses subjective camera work, tactile aesthetic, and a focus on the female adolescence to transform British social realism from something that is traditionally defined by a more masculine and objective observation into one that hails greater social effects. By using her second feature, Fish Tank, as a case study, I will evaluate contemporary debates to show how Arnold's work makes way for a more effective, broader, and inclusive interpretation of the genre by reconfiguring it through female subjectivity and poetic realism. The history of British social realism and its masculine tradition. British social realism was developed from the documentary movement of the 1930s, led by Scottish filmmaker and film theorist John Grierson. Positioning cinema as a tool for social education, Grierson described documentary as the creative treatment of actuality. Subsequently, the social realism point of view was picked up by the British free cinema movement from 1956 to 1958, and later emerged as a dominant cinematic style during the British New Wave from 1958 onwards until 1964. These traditions later informed films such as Saturday Night and Sunday Morning and The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner, which centred on working-class male protagonists navigating social and economic instability, not forgetting BBC Radio factual programmes. However, these social realist films positioned working-class masculinity as the main site of social struggle, marginalising female subjectivity and reducing women to peripheral or domestic roles. Film historians Hallam and Marshman note that social realist cinema aims to reveal the underbelly of urban life, depicting working-class communities in order to stimulate political awareness amongst audiences. It is also noted by film scholar David Forrest that the national is fundamental to both the aesthetic style and political concerns of contemporary realist film. However, historically, these depictions are very one-sided. As film scholar Sarah Hill notes, British cinema has so often been associated with masculinity. Likewise, Stella Hockenhall identifies a persistent masculine bias within the genre, where narratives frequently privilege male labour and male experience. Therefore, although British social realism aims to expose social inequality, it simultaneously emphasises gender hierarchy by privileging the male experience. It could be argued, however, contemporary films such as Kes, or later works by directors like Mike Leigh, have explored vulnerability, youth, and domestic life alongside traditional masculine narratives. While this is true, female subjectivity has rarely occupied the central perspective of the genre, in the same sustained way that it does in Andrea Arnold's work. Evidence suggests that rather than simply adding a female protagonist to an existing framework, Arnold shifted the entire emotional and aesthetic orientation of social realism towards the lived experience of girlhood. This essay highlights, by not focusing on the traditional narrative style and aesthetic, and by instead centering on the female perspective, Arnold exposes a side of the national which has not yet been uncovered by the traditional, ultimately broadening what it means to be a social realist film. Andrea Arnold as a feminist auteur. Andrea Arnold's work can be understood through the framework of the auteur theory, which emphasizes the director as the primary creative voice behind a film. John Corby describes auteurism as the presence of a recognizable authorial signature that reoccurs across the director's films. Throughout her works, Arnold's films repeatedly explore themes of marginalization, female adolescence, and emotional isolation within working class environments. Her work is interpreted as feminist social realism, her distinct style and aesthetic suggesting she fits into the framework of an auteur. However, the concept of auteurism has also been criticised within feminist film theory. Scholars such as Claire Johnson argue that auteur theory can reinforce patriarchal ideas of artistic genius by privileging individual authorship within a male-dominated industry. From this perspective, celebrating Arnold as an auteur could risk reproducing the same hierarchical framework that has historically marginalised women filmmakers. Yet Arnold's work simultaneously challenges this tradition. As Pam Cook notes, feminist filmmaking often involves reclaiming authorship to create alternate cinematic perspectives. Arnold's authorship is therefore significant, not simply because she directs the films, but because her work prioritises female experience in a genre traditionally dominated by male perspectives. As Caminiti argues, in a film magazine reviewing Fish Tank, Arnold's films aim to shed light on implicit and explicit violence that women experience because of class and gender oppression. Therefore, this suggests that Arnold's auteurism becomes a politically significant intervention rather than merely a stylistic signature. For example, by creating an aesthetic that pushes back against tradition, she makes way for broader interpretation and analysis of her films. Her poetic framing, female perspective, and emotionally driven narratives allow audiences to feel and be connected to her protagonists, which enables them to understand the oppression that her characters face. So, this feminist perspective ultimately exposes the hidden corners of women in poverty and aligns with the political agenda associated with British social realism. Poetic realism and narrative ambiguity. Arnold expands on realism aesthetically through her poetic framing of each scene. Andrei Tarkovsky, a Soviet writer and director often referred to as the master of poetic cinema, stresses the importance of emotion and irrationality to transcend verbal language, often depicted through rhythm, metaphors, and symbolism. Arnold mirrors this poetic mode of approach throughout the film, using animalistic imagery, symbolism, and metaphors alongside distinct sound and cinematography. A key poetic technique is Arnold's use of diegetic sound and rhythm. During an intimate scene when Connor carries Mia to bed, the scene slows, and the sound of her breath leads. Acting as an expression of her attraction, we feel connected to and drawn in by this repetitive act of breathwork. Importance is placed on her desires. This technique can be seen throughout the film, inviting the audience to feel with Mia, reinforcing their connection to the character. Therefore, by blurring the line between realism and expression, emotional resonance is formed, creating a deeper impact on an audience's awareness of her social situation. Professor and author Clive Nwonka suggests, however, that these poetic techniques represent a depoliticized form of British social realism. The fact that Mia plays truant is less important to the audience than her emotional state, and we feel sorry for her. By shifting focus towards this individual emotion and subjectivity and away from broader social and structural issues, the film therefore has less political impact. However, it could be argued that mood and perspective allow for a more implicit engagement with social conditions and politics. By reframing social realism as artistic expression, Arnold's multiple themes introduce layers of meaning and interpretation. By externalizing Mia's emotional state, the sequences merge realism and lyrical filmmaking, suggesting social realism can coexist in harmony with aesthetic experimentation. Consequently, Arnold's style of blending social realism and poetic filmmaking is evocative and has a greater emotional impact, which could lead to more political change. The space and time in which the female protagonist lives in Fish Tank is conditioned by the nature of modern-day capitalism in Western culture. Sheila Robotham, a socialist, Marxist, feminist and historian, discusses in her book Hidden from History the changing societal, economic and political position of women in Britain. From this data, we can see how the rise of capitalism fundamentally reshaped female subjugation. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, work was divided into paid male labour and unpaid female domestic work, ultimately forcing women to rely on male income. According to Robotham, women in urban settings were forced into underpaid factory work, exploitation that was mirrored, reinforced and repeated in the domestic home. This was even more prevalent in some age groups than over others. Oppression of women therefore became a continuous cycle that remains true to this day. Arnold allows her female protagonist Mia to live and move through these spaces that are a direct result of the rise of industrialization, her character revealing the capitalist exploitation of young working class women. The peripheral natural spaces, confining 4:3 aspect ratio, and endless concrete structures act as the walls of an aquarium. Our female protagonist is trapped in the cycle of poverty, with a complete lack of control over her environment and no flexibility to dominate it. The estate is central to the character's oppression, and Arnold allows her to play out her role within the context of the film, which ultimately acts as a critique on capitalism. Urban theorist Henry Lefebvre argues that space is socially produced, shaped by the relationships and power structures that exist within society. Mia's identity becomes intertwined with the deindustrialized estate, allowing it to function not only as a location, but as an emotional and psychological landscape. As she moves between interior domestic spaces and exterior landscapes, her home becomes a site of both confinement and exploration. As a result, her struggle for autonomy and desire for escape forms the backdrop of her world. Some scholars believe, however, that by introducing critical analysis to the estate, it inadvertently reduces its social impact. Roddick states in an article that Arnold's films offer little insight into social relations, precisely because they aren't grounded in reality, implying that contemporary realism's poetic quality makes them frivolous, cheap, and not very convincing at all. This therefore implies that by focusing on Arnold's audiovisual fantasy world, it takes away from the effective realist quality and negates Arnold's political agenda. But what even constitutes realistic cinema? Forrest points out that there lies a persistent impulse in British cinema to conceive, interpret, and confront the real in multiple ways, suggesting that as there is no one way to define a direct realist tradition, it simply must not exist. It could be argued that both critics are right. Art is subjective, and if Arnold's feminist and poetic realism to Roddick lands as frivolous, perhaps it is because he does not understand the implicit inner workings of a young woman. Building from what Forrest contends, his definition of the real is different to somebody else's. Social realism is wide, diversive, and progressive. And artists construct personal engagements with their social and political landscapes. As Doreen Massey argues, space is produced through social relations, including gender. Therefore, perhaps gender impacts the way Arnold's art is interpreted. If we closely examine space in Arnold's work, we can see how the estate transforms into something that is formed by gendered experience. Fantasy does not take away from space and realism, but reshapes it. It becomes personal, reflecting the vulnerabilities and restraints of girlhood. Therefore, space is not just socioeconomic, but psychological and gendered. As Bolton notes, Mia's world is very female. As a result, by centering the narrative on Mia's subjective experience of space, Arnold therefore shifts social realism away from detached observation and towards emotional immersion. Phenomenology and embodied spectatorship. Another way audiences become immersed in Arnold's cinema is through her distinct stylistic use of handheld cinematography. Film scholar Amber Jacobs describes Arnold's camera work as creaturely, suggesting that it behaves almost like a living presence moving alongside the character. They go on to suggest that the audience takes on an almost motherly role over Mia, the camera technique emitting a sense of care, a being witness. This is also shown through the film's 4:3 aspect ratio, visually trapping Mia within the frame. This approach aligns with phenomenological film theory, which is defined as the study of the viewer's lived experience, focusing on sensory, spatial, and temporal aspects of cinema. Professor Emerita Vivian Sobchack argues that cinema is experienced through embodied perception, where viewers engage with films, not only intellectually but physically. Similarly, philosopher and scholar Laura Marx describes certain cinematic images as producing haptic visuality, where spectators experience films through sensory engagement rather than distant observation. Arnold's emphasis on tactile imagery, skin, sweat, concrete, grass, creates what Thornton describes as a focus on tactile detail. However, Goss suggests that his cinematic technique is less overtly message-laden and more phenomenological, placing more importance on the sensory experience over the social and political aspect of the film. I believe, however, that because the audience embodies Mia's emotions, it intensifies its political commentary, rather than eroding it. By placing the spectator within Mia's bodily experience, it is not due to the maternal mode that Jacob mentioned earlier, which the camera occupies, but instead, the audience becomes Mia. Her anger, neglect, and female perspective become our own. In doing this, Arnold forces audiences to directly confront the emotional consequences of poverty, neglect, and gender inequality. Consequently, I believe the film combines phenomenological immersion with social critique, rather than replacing one for another, a technique that therefore expands on traditional realism. In conclusion, by incorporating feminist authorship, phenomenological cinematography, and poetic symbolism, this essay demonstrates that Arnold has reshaped a genre traditionally dominated by male narratives. By allowing her female protagonists to play out the roles of urban women within a Western capitalist society, poverty, neglect, and gender inequality become central to the narrative and theme. This is ultimately evocative and is historical in any critique of Western capitalism and society. By inviting an audience to feel the social inequalities represented by the film rather than simply observe them, Arnold has been successful at creating a form of realism that incites a type of politics that is more intimate, affective, and in tune to the complexities of womanhood. So, in summary, to answer the question, has Andrea Arnold's fish tank redefined the social real? I believe it has. What do you think?